The Ukrainian saw the Russians approaching the house where he was trying to rest. He looked worried, knowing he would have to face all three of them alone. Those were difficult days. In the direction of Pokrovsk, with the siege almost closing in on cities like Mirnorad, rifles fired, desperate men looked at the drones ready to bring them death. Despair hung in the hearts of the soldiers who headed to the battlefield with orders to follow. The news in November 2025 on the Ukrainian front was mainly about the imminent fall of Pokrovsk, a city that had become the main Russian target in Donetsk after the loss of Avdiivka. After months of rapid advance, the Russians were stopped at the Ukrainian barriers and had to start a pincer movement to capture the objective. In the northern part of the advance was Mynorad, where Alexander, junior sergeant of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, was stationed. He managed to keep a smile on his face, even in the face of the horror he would go through before that soldier set foot there, interrupting his dream and his profession. The city was home to about 46,000 inhabitants, many of whom were employed in coal mining. All these people lived there before the first bombs started to fall in 2024, before Alexander arrived in 2025. One of the first and most notorious attacks occurred in January 2024, hitting a temporary deployment point of the Ukrainian armed forces. The explosions echoed throughout the city, and the population soon discovered the tragic target. 16 Ukrainian soldiers died and another 20 were buried that day. The result of a serious mistake in which orders to avoid large gatherings were disobeyed. Soon the bombings began to have less precise targets, and the explosions intensified as the Russians advanced toward Pokrovsk. The marks of death were exposed in Mynorad. 4 people lost their lives in one of these attacks in July 2024. 3 men, including a 42-year-old bus driver, died at the scene, and a woman passed away at the hospital. Among the injured was a 16-year-old boy and 8 other people aged between 20 and 62 years old. The destruction spread. The war carved its sick works, creating yet another open-air museum in honor of the darkest corners of the human soul. Mynorad transformed himself, adapting to the landscape of the Donetsk battlefield and forgetting the airs of civilization. War was pure destruction, always. The population was evacuated in waves. Alexander was already at the front during this period, but his brigade was still fighting in the outskirts of Mynorad. Many times he had to take shelter in the trenches, trying to hold back the enemy's advance from precarious positions, with only a few comrades to withstand the waves of attack. When the drones failed to stop the opponents, the Russians unleashed bullets. The enemies tried to be stealthy, but from inside the shelter, the soldier of the 79th Brigade aimed the CZ-805 Bren rifle Zvalkin, unleashing hell that tore apart the Russian bodies, raising dust and blood. In the chaos of the gunfire, a burst took down the opponents who were running across the field. The efforts seemed useless for every dead Russian. Another 10 were walking toward the defenders. In no time, the Russians were at the gates of Mynorad. By April 2025, they had seized Orodrivka. Their infantry fighting vehicles began to cross the fields, firing cannons. The targets were the Ukrainian trenches. Further ahead, electronic interference held back the drones along the way, while ammunition shattered the trees where the Ukrainians were hiding. The enemy achieved their objective, landing soldiers for the first waves of attack on the outskirts of the city. Losing the trenches prompted a reaction from the units. 425th Independent Assault Battalion Skala specialized in counterattacks and capturing positions. The Cossack armored vehicle dropped the soldiers at the edge of the forest. They spread out around the perimeter, waiting for instructions from the drones. Meanwhile, the observers detected Russian movement. The Moscow soldiers tried to hide their thermal signatures with special covers. The first detonations hit them when they stopped to try to hide better. The Moscow squad suffered from those initial attacks. The heat of their bodies mixed with that of the explosions, only to disappear later in the cold of death. Meanwhile, Scala's soldiers threw grenades at the cornered men. The Ukrainians coordinated the action before aiming their rifles at the entrances to Putin's men's hideouts. The shots finished off the hidden Russians. The fragmentation aviation bombs made their thunderous appearance in Mirnorad. Alexander was already there, watching friends get pulverized. The Moscow Air Force had plenty of these glide bombs to demolish Ukrainian buildings. The massive arrival of these explosives accelerated the collapse of the urban structure. Fire swept through the city, engulfing homes, apartments, and playgrounds burned under the watch of soldiers who tried to protect what was left. The Russians would still persist, starting with a mistake. It was undeniable that the Russian bombings were effective in destroying Ukrainian forces in any sector of the front. The smoke rising up to the sky was part of the daily landscape of the fighting. Something that had become less common, however, were attacks with armored vehicles. Unlike what was happening south of Pokrovsk, with small infantry squads advancing through the city, the Russian command decided to send 3 armored vehicles for an assault. The Mynorad threat. The interception of the column began in the village of Rodivisa, which had already been taken by the Russians earlier. The first kamikaze drone descended on a tank. A second one was needed to paralyze the machine, and the third exploded to mark the end of the advance. A fourth drone came to hit the rear of a troop transport vehicle. The fire consumed the weakest part of the Russian equipment, immobilizing the second vehicle of that small column. Smaller explosions started to appear in the field. Now the targets were the Russian soldiers who had escaped from the burning metal. There were many explosions in a row, ending yet another mistake by the Russian commanders at the cost of lives. A hexacopter appeared to finish the job, using incendiary ammunition to ensure that the equipment could not be recovered. If a soldier managed to escape and get close, other men like Alexander were ready to surprise the lone Russian with the efficiency of the CZ-805 Bremen rifle tearing through his organs. These attacks in the direction of Mirnorad came at a high cost, which was recorded by Moscow's own soldiers. During a motorcycle advance, they went through difficult terrain, speeding through. Among the war sculptures created by the conflict, there were dozens of carcasses, some of which must still contain remains. The Russian bombings continued to be more effective, destroying the places where the Ukrainians were taking shelter. The use of drones to identify the artillery pieces around Mynorad helped to disable instruments like the M777 howitzer. After being hit by a kamikaze detonation, the weapon would no longer have a chance to stop the Russian advances. Alexander heard the news about death, destruction, and the siege. Pokrovsk laughed, thinking that he was a chef a few months ago. Now he was in the middle of a frying pan, with the heat on high, trying to fry him. Until then, he had to hold on so he wouldn't become just another ingredient in the war's soup of corpses. The pressure kept increasing towards Mynorad, with drones searching for the Ukrainian infantry moving inside the city. With each series of explosions over the buildings, many soldiers were forced to leave the burning structures and ended up being hunted by the drones. The Russians used the dense year-end fog to try to bring more troops into Mynorad, risking mechanized assaults with armored vehicles protected by anti-drone screens. The Ukrainians began attacking the vehicles, but the first kamikaze drones were not enough to stop the machines. Only after successive impacts did the propulsion system finally give in. Without transportation, the Russians tried to continue on foot, but the drones dominated the sky and began their voracious dives. The motorcyclists didn't have better luck. The fog temporarily dissipated, granting the necessary visibility. To be shattered by Ukrainian attacks, the Russians sent more fragmentation aviation bombs, each heavier than the last, to create an ever-growing zone of horror. For the defenders of Minorad, the mission was to make them feel surrounded, isolated, and with the sky falling down. Glide bombs had a wide blast radius, shattering buildings and throwing debris for hundreds of meters. Those pieces of concrete were like projectiles seeking the lives of more soldiers. Their drones also hunted Ukrainian transports, especially in the narrow strait toward Pokrovsk, an area the Russians wanted to close off, to complete the circus. By that time, at the end of November, even though there were no Moscow troops in that exact location, the drones and bombs had created a deadly road filled with metal wreckage and Ukrainian corpses. The Russian mechanized assaults continued in the rush to get as many soldiers as possible into Mynorad. The politicians claimed that the battle was already won, so the commanders pushed forward at the cost of the 79th Brigade's drones. Falling onto the vehicles, they went up in flames along the road. The disembarked soldiers met their deaths from the impact of more drones. And it wasn't just the 79th Brigade doing their job. The Marine Brigade stopped another Russian assault. The machines exploded on the roads leading to the city. With a deafening crack, the drones crashed into the motorcycles, scattering sparks and chaos across the asphalt. The soldiers who escaped looked up at the sky in fear, waiting for the end to come. With a bomb dropped by a hexacopter, which then left to deliver death to the others. In the midst of one of these assaults, they covered their advance by throwing a grenade at the mines prepared by the Ukrainians. The reckless strategy caused an explosion that took his life into the fire. The destroyed Russian equipment clogged the roads. There were so many drones in the sky searching for targets that the twisted, still burning metal structures were filmed by operators who arrived to destroy those that could still be recovered. Taking the opportunity to hunt for hidden soldiers as well, still, some of Moscow's men managed to get through the defenses. Little by little, these troops spread out through Mirnorad, infiltrating the buildings. The order was to take position. These men filmed themselves deeper and deeper inside the city, walking calmly and announcing victory. It seemed everything was lost for the Ukrainians at that moment if only the Russian footage was considered. It was, in fact, desperate for the men of Kiev, but Alexander was there, along with others from the 79th Air Assault Brigade. He received information from the kamikazes who were pursuing the invaders. There were still Ukrainian forces trying to protect the territory. As difficult as the situation was, Putin's conquest would be paid for with a lot of blood. These soldiers tried to hide, but the kamikazes found them and went after their shelters. Aware of the risk, the Ukrainians began to ambush the Russians. Assault groups like Alexander's were in a critical situation. Some Russians were arrogantly walking through Mirnorad until they came across a hidden soldier. A Russian tried to raise his hands in surrender, but the Ukrainian shot him directly and then returned to his mission. Some would claim that the Russian might have been drawing his weapon, but the truth is that the corpse remained on the road, marking the site of a war crime. Meanwhile, Alexander continued through Mirnorad on his relentless hunt. He leaned against a tree, concealing his silhouette, while the shots from his rifle tore through Russian flesh. What the rifle couldn't solve was handled with a grenade launcher. After 2 shots, there was one less Russian in the city. The command indicated that 2 enemies were hiding in a basement. Alexander approached, under cover from a friend, and threw the grenade. Smoke came out of the darkness where the bodies lay. After that, more explosives were thrown by Alexander and his partner, where another pair was hiding. Sometimes a Russian soldier survived the explosion, but the Ukrainians were close by, watching with their rifles aimed at the man as he crawled out. They executed anyone who didn't surrender immediately. The work couldn't stop. Those were intense days. With so many enemies around, grenades weren't the biggest explosion Alexander had in store. They prepared an anti-tank mine to detonate inside a basement in there. The explosion spun in the darkness, briefly lighting up the Russians' eyes before they were consumed by the grim void of death. The drones detected 3 Russians hiding in a house. Alexander and his companion had another anti-tank mine with them. They threw it in quickly and ran out, aware of the short interval. Before the blast, the house became a hurricane of debris. No Russians survived the encounter with the fire. After that, they started to surrender, but the tension hadn't passed. Dealing with surrendered men in a city surrounded by enemies was almost madness, especially with just a pair of us for so many prisoners. When they stopped to rest, Alexander was soon surrounded by 3 Russians prowling near the house. He held the rifle while his partner watched the prisoners, the gloves retained. With nervous sweat on his hands, he began to raise the weapon. As he saw them getting closer, they were careless with their weapons lowered. The Ukrainian slowly flexed his finger on the trigger, waiting for them to line up in his sights. As soon as the barrel spat fire, the pair in front collapsed, as if their lifelines had been cut and their bodies violently shaken by the multiple impacts of the 5.56 caliber. The last one in line tried to escape and turned his back, allowing the bullets to pierce his skin and bury themselves in his lungs. Alexander went to check the dead before moving again. After that day, he could still dream of becoming a boss again and starting a family, but that would only be the dream of someone who didn't see the invasion of his country ending anytime soon. He would be evacuated from Mjolnir after his deeds, but the Russians kept bombing the city and sending more and more men to spread out among the buildings. By early December 2025, they already occupied much of eastern Mjolnir. They walked over bodies sent by leaders who had goals to achieve, spending human lives in the process.